And now the second session is all about the evolving future of diversity and inclusion. This is a panel discussion, and chair and moderator of this panel discussion is Syed Veqar Lamm. He is the CEO and director of Jaffer Business Systems. He is also on the boards of many public and private sector organizations. Earlier, he headed Nokia Siemens Network as the head of Middle East Africa, and also the head of Teradata and NCR Corporation. Over to you, Veqar, for your panel. The time is limited now. The time is 8:11, so I'm cutting down 10 minutes from your panel. So you have over to you, and you will introduce the panelists, the learned panelists with us.
Thank you very much, Jaffer. Thank you so very much. I'm just picking on from Shelley, where she talked about a new normal. We all hope, we all pray that new normal happens soon. And it is a much better normal, much more inclusive, and much more diverse normal than what we have seen in this world thus far. All our prayers for those who have been affected by Corona, and our prayers for all those who are out there to remain safe. A very quick public service message from Corporate Pakistan Group. Stay safe, stay healthy, practice social distancing, and remain hopeful. Just a few logistics before we move on. Just in case technology plays up, we have a backup moderator and panelist. And in case I get kicked out, Ghazanfar Ali, my fellow colleague and friend who is the country head of IBM, will take over from me and run the panel smoothly. He will also be sifting through questions and comments we are receiving on Zoom as well as Facebook. And at the end, depending on the time and depending on how ruthless Asfar is in terms of timing, we will decide how many questions we are going to take. I'll just quickly introduce the subject, and then we'll go to the panelists and we'll introduce each of the panelists as we go along. So as far as diversity and inclusion, a lot of time I think people do not understand the importance, significance, and improvement it brings to the workplace. McKinsey, in its research report, says that organizations which are ethnically diverse will tend to outperform their homogeneous counterparts by at least 35%. 35%, that's very significant. Harvard Business Review, in its research report, says that organizations which are ethnically diverse will have 70% more market access compared to their homogeneous counterparts. That's the importance and significance of diversity and inclusion as we move along. While diversity is about picking from a broader talent pool to create a strong, talented team of individuals in the corporation, inclusivity is about how you build a culture and put diversity into action. As far as I'm concerned, I want all my learned panelists to, in their intro, to talk about three things as we try and define how the future of workplace will evolve, keeping in view the diversity and inclusion. The first is, as we are meeting in the wake of this unprecedented crisis facing the humanity about this coronavirus. First is, and the question that was asked previously, will this change anything? Will this make things less diverse or less inclusive, or will it make any significant difference towards better? The other point to consider in terms of pandemic is that the more connected you are, as this virus is more or less teaching us, the more exposed you get to the virus. So does that mean that the world will move towards a more localized version of diversity and inclusivity, and the things like global executive is going to fade away? The second point, once we've moved to from the pandemic issue, I would like panelists to talk about is how are they seeing new executives who will change or who will take over from the aging population of so-called baby bloomers, who are the millennials and the Gen Z? How do you think they'll shape the future of diversity and inclusion as we move along? And that's also an important topic to consider. So first is about pandemic and the changes. Second is aging population. And third very important element, as we have an international panel joining us from more or less various continents of the world, is diversity and inclusion different by each location and by each industry? Or is it universally applied? Doesn't matter which location, which industry. So it would be great to hear from all the great panelists. I would first like to go to Africa and start from there. We have Maria Sarungi Tsehai, who is the founder and founder ChangeTanzania and CEO Kwanza TV and Compass Communication Africa, to give her opening comment. Maria, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you so much, Sid, and everyone. Hello. We're going to be seeing more and more of this around the world, I think. I just right now been talking to some of my colleagues who are not that tech savvy, just to get immediately into what we're talking about, the coronavirus or the COVID-19. And I just have to start telling them, you have to download Zoom, you have to download Skype, you know, and then there is many other apps. So this is going to be the future. Getting back to diversity and inclusion, I think that what you just introduced, Syed, about the fact that diversity does lead to inclusion, but also does lead to much more efficiency in an organization is very true. And I wanted to look at it more from a regional point of view, like from Africa, but also mainly from Eastern Africa, where I'm based right now. I think that when we talk about the fact how the coronavirus has impacted all of us, I think that the difference that we will see eventually when it comes to diversity and inclusion is going to be that, unfortunately, a lot of people will be left behind. But in this part of the world, those who will be left behind are not necessarily gender only or just cultural, but there is what we call a class issue. Those who are coming from a lower income country. And that has become a problem because for most of us from lower income country, we will be more localized, but it's not necessarily better if we're not well prepared. Our education system is not prepared very well. Our infrastructure is not prepared very well. So it may look like an opportunity, but we need to make so much huge changes that without financing from the international community, without that international support, we may not be able to see that kind of inclusion. In fact, I think that there'll be much more leaving behind, especially for the youth and the women. We're seeing some very, very distressing statistics. If we look at the workforce, which is the former employed workforce, we see that men are in the formal employed sector by 40% in Tanzania, while women are only about 20%, 17 to 20% that are formally employed. The rest usually are in informal employment, or they're in unpaid work. So we've got huge problems when it comes to women being left behind. The coronavirus is not going to make this better, because somebody who's employed may even be reassured of some benefits while out of work, while a woman who is depending on selling her food, selling her goods every day, or the young people that we have got, thousands of them selling on the street small stuff, and they're street vendors, they will be impacted and they immediately will have an existential problem. So I would like to move on now to a very important question you asked about the change, right? The change of guard, as you say, from the executives. And I think that looking at it, the first and foremost that comes to my mind is the fact that women, especially in Tanzania, are being left behind. That is a big problem. We have got two major issues that we face at a very young age if you're a woman. First of all, there is the issue of child marriage. Right now, the High Court has ruled that the law that allows children as young as the age of 14 to get married is unconstitutional. But what we're waiting to see is the actual implementation of this ruling. But then there's another issue that has become a very hot button issue right now in our country, and that's about pregnant schoolgirls. What it has come to be seen is that about 27% of the young girls do become pregnant, and because of the regulations and policies, and of course the attitude as well of the country, young girls are expelled from school. well, some people put euphemism, they say they drop out, but it's the same thing. Once you become pregnant, you drop out of the system, whether because you're forced or whether because you cannot afford or you don't have the time. And what is happening is a lot of women are left behind. Only 11% of women in Tanzania have a higher education, secondary school, and so forth, meaning most of them are poor and illiterate. So what does that mean when you talk about the change of guard? You cannot, as a company, say you will employ someone based purely on diversity because she is a woman, or because she's coming from a certain tribal group, or she's coming from a certain religion. There has to be some form of qualification. Now, if qualification is going to be such a problem for a given group of society, it means that it will just remain as a dream. The other big problem, just to finish up, is that aging group that you're talking about, for us in Africa, are not quitting their jobs. They actually stay on quite long, and the unemployment among the youth is very high. There has been a lot of calls to get them employed, but getting them into formal employment is a huge problem. So still, they remain hugely as informal employees. I'm ready to take on far more discussions. I've got a lot of things I want to talk about, but let me stop here to allow other people to also put in the very important inputs.
Thank you, Maria. Interesting comments and how you see Africa being a developing continent, if you like, and in some cases or in some countries underdeveloped, how you see the risk of diversity and inclusion actually going back, and also interestingly how you see millennials and Gen Z not taking over that fast compared to maybe rest of the world. So it would be good to hear perspective from other speakers, and who best than to move to the world of sports. And we have James Michael Lafferty, who is an Olympic coach, philanthropist, and an author, to talk about future of workplace. James, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me well. I'm based in Dubai, so I consider, at least from a gender diversity standpoint, I'm at ground zero in a region that is, significantly behind other parts of the world. If you take a look at the COVID-19 crisis, I mean, I'm quite optimistic. I think that we're going to exit this with more diversity than less, and I'll tell you why. In the company that I run here, Fine Hygienic Holding, is a company I took over 2 years ago that was near bankruptcy, and it was male dominated with 100% of senior management men coming from only two countries. One of the big changes we made is I basically mandated that we would change out the management team, and we went to 30% women overnight and 9 nationalities, and the profits have tripled in the last 2 years, and the company's completely out of trouble. And it validates the Harvard study and McKinsey study, which is when you get, I'm in a business, it's the paper business and the wellness business. The people buying our products are women. Why don't we have any women on the management team? I mean, it defies any sense of logic. You have men trying to market to women who don't understand even the consumer. So this was a basic move. Now, if you look at this current crisis, I've been on a few phone calls with other CEOs. A lot of companies are not going to survive this, and we're going to be in a lockdown a lot longer than we think. The lockdowns in some shape or form is going to go on for at least a year, because you can't let people out until there's a vaccine. And until we have a vaccine, you can't have people grouping together. We're going to see many companies go under, and the companies that are going to survive are the ones with the most diversity, because diverse organizations are more flexible than rigid organizations, and they're going to find their way through this better, and they're certainly more resilient. And resiliency is going to be everything when it comes to surviving this current COVID-19 crisis. I'm also quite optimistic about the millennials. I think every generation, I'm a baby boomer born in the early 60s. I think every generation gets trashed by the older generation. When I was growing up, all my parents did was shake their head at me and say, you kids are so lazy. I used to walk 20 kilometers to school and blah, blah, blah. And, you guys are so useless, and, you're never going to make it. And I'm terrified to become a senior citizen if you're going to take care of me. And you know what? We turned out fine. And, the Gen Xers are doing just fine. These millennials have taken more grief than any generation in history. They're constantly trashed on social media. They grew up in a world, the world I grew up in, if I made a mistake at a party in high school, 10 people saw it and they laughed at me. Today, a kid makes a mistake in a party and he gets 1 million views on YouTube, and they're driven to suicide. These kids live in an incredible, stressful world. I think they're doing beautifully. I think, but the big majority of my company are millennials. I think they're outstanding. So these generalizations from these Simon Sinek and these other people that they're all entitled and they're all lazy. What a terrible thing to say about an entire group of people that was born over a 15-year period. So I think the millennials, if you look at their voting trends and if you look at what they support, they tend to support diversity. They tend to rally against candidates that support xenophobia, racism, and gender discrimination. I think that when they take control, they're going to be just fine, and they're going to be pushing the agenda for diversity and inclusion much more than my generation has done. So all in all, we're making progress. We're a long way from where we need to be. I think it's a matter of survival for the Middle East. The Middle East needs to embrace and come up to speed quicker. And if they want to see more companies become global, that's the way to do it. But I'm confident that we'll make steady. It's going to be slow and it's going to be terrible, but we'll make steady progress. I'm an optimist by nature. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Very well said. Like you, I never thought I'll be making exactly the same comments that my father made to me, to my kids. But that's the way the world goes. What goes around comes around, as they say. I also love your comment about ground zero in the Middle East. And I think a lot of space and distance needs to be covered. And it's so heartening to hear about the work that has happened in your organization. The third comment that you made, which is also extremely important, that while we spoke about diverse companies outperforming by 35% and also about having more market access through Harvard Business Review, but you brought in a very interesting point, which is about they being more resilient, because they bring a different perspective and a lot more diversified viewpoint into how we handle the organization, and especially how we handle these crisis times. I completely agree with your comments on millennials, that they have been struck with a lot more challenges than the baby bloomers, if you like. And clearly, they are a lot more diverse in their thinking, and they are a lot more diverse and inclusive in the way they act. So very, very insightful comments. Thank you so very much for that. So from an Olympic coach, let's move to the media industry. So we have Etna Trainer. She's from CNBC Arabia. She's a CNBC Arabia special correspondent and consultant, and a media coach based out of Ireland. Etna, your take on the topic.
Hello there to all of you, and it's great to be joining you. I'm originally from Ireland, but I'm living in Dubai. So I have, I just spent my sort of school years in Ireland, and then like everybody did at the time, because we were living in a very uninclusive and undiverse country back in the day, we hit the boat, so to speak, and we were all out of there. So I went to university in Ireland and left, which an awful lot of people of my age at the time left. So when you look at a country that was once so lacking in inclusion and diversity, and that has absolutely flipped itself around to be probably one of the leaders now in terms of inclusion and diversity, it's really been an incredible success story in Ireland. But I don't live there anymore, so let me move back to where I am in this part of the world. And when we look at what's happening, I think, around COVID-19, we also have to look at some of the powerful women leaders who have stepped up in this. And we've seen, particularly some great leadership coming from many of the women leaders, particularly in Europe. And I also think we have to, look at the key medical advice that's coming from the US, from the key doctor there, and even from the UK, where, the main advisor, the medical advisor there. So it's great to see that there's some powerful expert women that are contributing to finding a solution. And also, what I say as a communicator, talking great common sense in this. I think it's very heartening to actually see that people are just really paying more attention to the facts and looking at what's going on. I'm probably a lot more optimistic in terms of what's going to come out of this. I really do think that we're seeing a time of tremendous unity, be it for gender diversity, racial diversity, anything. I mean, we're all in this together. And I think if any time this has been realized, this has hugely been realized and emphasized right across the world right now, that we really are looking at the great contribution that's coming from people from all over the world. And I think this has been hugely important. And, coming from people at different age groups, we just see the gentleman in the UK, what's his name, Tom Moore, the 99-year-old gentleman who has raised more money for the NHS, and they've appointed him a sort of an international fundraiser. So the fact that it's like everybody can get involved in this, and they're certainly on the good side, if there is to be a good side of this, tragic situation and pandemic that we're in, we're seeing, I think, a lot of, very powerful signals coming out that I would hope will be continued, and that people around the world will appreciate each other, no matter what race they are, no matter what gender they are, whether, they're old, young, handicapped, whatever. I think I'm hopeful and optimistic for that. Let me look a little bit to what you talk about in terms of leadership at the moment. And I mean, having grown up in a country and lived my life in a very non-diverse and non-inclusive country, it was, I have firsthand experience in this. And I really think we all have to look at the fact that we're looking at a huge societal change, right across the board. So we are. And we all remember, when things were so different. What Maria talks about in Africa, I was probably, almost in that situation many, many years ago. Perhaps, not in the poverty area, in the rural areas, but we certainly saw some of that. And it was probably only 50 years, before I was growing up, that it was like that, in rural parts of the country. So everybody's at a different stage of development, but I'm hugely optimistic for the key leaders that are in place. And I think what we're hearing, and we're hearing it particularly from leaders now, and I'll talk maybe a little bit about that later on, and from chief executives. And they're the ones that are standing up now and saying that they are going to insist that diversity and inclusion is part of their mission, I guess, for want of a better word, in future, whereby before it might have been in there in the fine print and it might have been assigned to the HR people talked about it, or, it was talked about, but it was never taken at, the key CEO level. And I think this is hugely encouraging. So there's lots more we can talk about, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
So thank you very much, Etna, for again very insightful comments, and it's good that you brought about the similarities between what Maria talked about in her intro and how you saw Ireland, which was non-inclusive, non-diverse in the beginning, and then moving away to a different place to see a different world. Another very important thing you brought about is that you see future. Of course, we all need to stay optimistic, and we should, but you also brought about an interesting topic where diversity and inclusion needs to become more like a mission of the chief executive and mission of the organization, and needs to become an embedded part of how organizations shape the future. And that's very important. And we have heard some very interesting comments. Diversity makes it more resilient. We need to make it part of the mission. While we see a class issue in some parts of the world, but it needs to move away and a lot more awareness is going to come in. So I think on this point, it would be good for me to move in the world of events, if you like. So we have Marine Debate, who is Head of Event Solution Asia Pacific at BI Workplace. Marine, you're on. Your take on the subject.
Hello, everybody. It's close to midnight for me, so apologies if you're not going to see my video. We're just going to have to focus on my voice. So good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you're hearing us from. So my take is really seeing this from my perspective. So for those who are not familiar with the acronym, it's Meeting, Incentive, Conference, and Events. So that's the industry I have been into for about 15 years, and all the time in Asia. My take on diversity and inclusion mainly for the two countries that I've spent my 15 years here, being China and Singapore, is that we're actually doing quite okay. My industry is waging also pretty well for women. It's actually quite unbelievable. You get to any of our conferences and it's just women everywhere. And to be frank, at BI Worldwide, we even had to make conscious choices to hire men at some point. When we opened our Singapore office 7 years ago, there was literally only one man. And then our VP joined us, but we literally had to make efforts to bring men on board. And we do a lot of customer service and events and participant support and so on and so forth. So maybe there's a reason to that. We've done better now. We're about 30% of men. So we're working on our diversity on our way as well. I've been lucky to work my whole life in Asia, and I must say China has been really an eye opener on women, because I mean, there's so much criticism about the country, but if you look at their place on the Georgetown Institute index, they're actually number 76 out of 150. They actually score pretty well. They even gain about 10 places in the ranks between 2018 and 2019. And to be honest, spending almost 10 years in Shanghai, I must say that this is a really woman-driven city. So I'm quite happy and thankful to see and say and also contribute into the fact that MICE is really quite open for women. Now, do we have progress to do? Of course. I mean, getting higher in the ranks is always, a question. There's always some advocacy to do. I mean, I don't know if that's the fact that I was raised in France, but I recognize myself in Shelley earlier saying she was a rule breaker or rule maker. And I also do advocate for my local teams of women here on wedding leave and parental leave and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, I think, we're in a fairly good place right now. If there is a few areas that I would hope my industry to work a little bit better on is actually including the aging population, because we don't last very long in this industry. I am a millennial. I'm a very early millennial, but I still qualify. So I am one of these change maker, and for whom diversity is not a question; it's a fact. But I'm more worried and considering can we bring people from other generation and older generations actually. Disabled people as well, if we're talking about inclusion, is a big topic for me. And then certain jobs, obviously more technical, do not see a lot of women. And that's, I think, habits probably, especially technical when I'm thinking about audiovisual and all these production and construction. So yeah, I mean, I think on our side, COVID, obviously, as you can imagine, we're probably number one with hospitality and airlines. We're in the same basket. So our industries are definitely in danger. But the reality is we also fulfill a need of people coming together and seeing each other. I mean, Zoom can only go so far. I think as far I would have wanted to see all of us live. So we make do with what we have right now. But I'm convinced that what we do for a living in getting people together will pick up, because we'll all have that need to come up together again. So yeah, that's kind of my 2 cents on this and the current challenge, I would say. Hope this is helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Marine. On a lighter note, all the profile you mentioned about men, if you have an opening, let me know. I fit into all of them.
Noted.
But you made an interesting comment, and especially your comments about China are very encouraging, that you do see diversity. Of course, it can always be done better. And it's also great to hear a millennial talking about how she sees things evolving in this world. Clearly, all industries are affected. Anything related to travel clearly is going to be affected a lot more. So, of course, our prayers with everyone and each one of you out there. But you also talked about, or you brought another dimension into the debate, which is about having women is not that much of a problem. Are they going up the rank? And is that happening enough? Is something that the world possibly needs to be more aware of. And that's an interesting perspective to be clearly being aware of and need to work on. On that note, let me move to our final panelist, which is Birgit Lamm. She's a country head, Friedrich Naumann Foundation, based out of Pakistan. Birgit, over to you.
Hello, thank you for all these very interesting inputs. So it's always a bit of a challenge to be the last one in a row of speakers, but at the same time, you can also comment on what the others have said. With regard to diversity, I think what you said at the beginning, that diversity is in fact an asset. That's a given point in management science, and there's been a lot of academic proof that diverse teams are more successful than non-diverse teams. But at the same time, psychology also has empirical proof that although diversity is an asset, most teams unconsciously, or team leaders rather go for homogeneous teams, because people are more comfortable with other people who are just like themselves or agree on the same issues. So diversity is also a challenge, because you have to move out of your comfort zone and you have to face disagreement. You need to face different approaches. So in the end, this, in terms of corporate policy, it's always a challenge. And yeah, moving over to the pandemic, well, this pandemic, just as any crisis, serves also as a driver or accelerator of trends that already exist. So if we talk about the new media, they've been around for more than 20 years, and I feel, and now we really feel the necessity to move on, to get more fluent with the digital media as well. At the same time, I would like to strengthen the point that Maria gave right at the beginning. Not everybody is well equipped with using these tools. So for example, if we talk about digitalization, not every country is just as good as doing that, and not every part of the population is just as well equipped. I live in Pakistan right now, and in Pakistan, only 37% of the population know about the internet, and the use of the internet stagnates at 80%. And it's about 21% of men and only 12% of women use it. And there we already come to disparities. So this thing which now brings us together, which is digital media, and also this globalization issue, everybody now knows we are all in this global issue of COVID-19. Nobody can escape from the world and go to another planet. So in a way, it's one thing that really makes us connect with everybody all around the world. At the same time, we are not all connected in the same way. It's great that through the new media, we get to know about new approaches, how to deal with COVID-19 practically in real time, and we are able to learn from each other. But we are only able to learn from each other if we have this great tool, which is the new media. But not everybody has it. And at the same time, people are exposed to the risk of COVID-19 in different ways. And looking also at the so-called global south, it's definitely the informal workers, it's those who live in cramped places who virtually cannot practice social distancing. And if you need to make a living, you need to get out and fetch water because you don't have a running tap in your own house. If you're an informal daily worker, you need to make a living. If you cannot do it, you will starve to death. So these people are much more affected. In Pakistan, it's about 70% of the population that works in the informal sector. So we are in this together, but we are affected in different ways. And I feel there's also a social, a huge social factor in how we are impacted by it. And that's nothing we can discuss or take away. So I feel these innovation issues, they are great, they can be part of the solution, but they are not available for everybody at the same time. So when we talk about inclusion, and we talk about diversity, it's not only men and women. We are also talking about class issues. We are talking about ethnic issues. We are talking about religious minorities as well. And I would like people also not to forget about these things. And I hope, but I'm a bit doubtful about it, that the whole COVID-19 crisis will actually hammer home a lesson that we should be, let's say, more open to the vulnerabilities that our societies have. And when you just have a look at the healthcare systems, the social security systems around the world, you see, even in the developing parts of Europe, that there are differences how the countries fare. You see that Italy and Spain, and also the US, which has, let's say, top-notch, high-tech healthcare facilities and the most advanced ways maybe of operating on an open heart. But now they really struggle in giving good healthcare system to the masses of the people. And there are other social security healthcare systems like in Central Europe, which apparently are able to mitigate these systems and provide better general access to larger parts of the population. So I feel we should study the governance systems. We should study also the economic policy, because once we are over with it, we need to get our economy back on the ground. And this is not just, let's say, a cool money-making thing, but the livelihood of our people depend on it. And I feel in this way, a social security system and also economic policies that help, especially small businesses, new businesses, get back on the ground and get on the feet because they provide employment. That's crucial also for social peace. And I feel populations, workers, as well as companies are only willing to put up with the drastic measures of social distancing as long as they feel that their governments have a legitimacy and also cater to their needs. And if these basic needs are not fulfilled, or they feel that the political and also the economic leadership in a way is not able to respond to these needs, I think we are going to be in a huge crisis. So yes, there is opportunity, but there is a huge risk involved as well when the leadership, especially political leadership and our governance institutions cannot respond to this demand.
Thank you, Birgit. Again, very insightful comments, and I'm glad you brought about the discussion on informal sector, and also the fact that while this virus is affecting everyone, irrespective of who you are, where you are, most powerful, most vulnerable, in possibly equal ways, but the effect it creates or it leaves on people and communities may be very different. And it does vary from class to class. The other point which is interesting, because as I hear each of the panelists, while some did express skepticism whether we'll learn enough lessons from this pandemic as we move ahead, while others are expressing more optimism, saying we will get better and we'll become a more diverse and more inclusive world, if you like. But you know, the one point which you brought about, which is very interesting, and that more or less leads me to the first question, and I'll quickly go over all the panelists to respond, except for you. I'll come back to you with another question, because many a time when we talk about diversity and inclusion, it somehow becomes a lot more of a gender thing, whereas it's a lot broader concept, right? And majority of time when diversity and inclusion topic comes up, it's somehow always become a man versus woman kind of a debate, rather than having a much broader debate and a much broader, talking about a much broader class of people. And I'm so glad you brought up this subject. So I want to first move to you. Is really diversity and inclusion a man and woman thing? Is that it?
I think it's the very obvious one. I think the fact that women have always been underrepresented in the workforce, I think. So that's just such a clear one. And then I think we look beyond that without a doubt. Now, I have a role within the media, and so I talk from that side too, but my specialty within the media is also the energy sector. And when we look at the energy sector, we're also looking at countries, with, tremendous resources, countries in Africa, who haven't seen the great wealth. They haven't seen, the man on the street has not seen that money in his pocket that he should have seen over the years. And, we look at the people who work in this industry. And again, that is very much a male-dominated industry, but that's also changing too. But I think the conversation had to come around to
where am I?
Female. Let's look at that one and get that in place. We have a visitor here. Hello. And, I that's only one part of it, but without a doubt, what you're talking about. And I think particularly for developing countries, I know I came across as probably a lot more optimistic, but, when I listened to Birgit there, and even from what Maria said as well, I'm not looking at the pockets, which are huge and, which make up the most part of the developing countries. And I think when it comes to energy as well, we look at, the UN sustainability goals, and they're talking about ending poverty in 2030. I mean, we have more than 1 billion people in the world right now who don't have access to energy. And getting access to energy really helps to look across class. It looks across, gender diversity. It looks across everything, because access to energy, sometimes it's what, gives children and families the opportunity to actually get education and to maintain education. And suddenly to bring education to people who haven't had it before is just, it's a huge, huge turnaround in terms of what can happen. So all of these things are really interconnected. And I think when we look at inclusion and diversity, we look at it in the key industries, I think, and what the industries can do in many ways to actually help enable inclusion and diversity. But it starts a lot, I think, with education, and that at some places and in some countries in the world, we really, really need to see starting to happen much faster and with greater support. I'm optimistic things will get better, but I do know, looking at figures and having interviewed many ministers from areas in Africa, and that many of them are saying that they're hoping to get 60% of their population on the grid and with access to energy by 2030. So I don't know how the UN hopes to end poverty by 2030 if 40% of the world is still going to be without the basics of energy, which for most of us is, a basic human right at this point.
Thank you, Etna. Maria, I want to come to you and taking few points from Etna as well, because you also brought up the subject of class when in your opening comment. Is there a need as we go into the future workplace and how diversity and inclusion will evolve? Is there a need to broaden the debate beyond just gender? Because it actually is a much broader topic. And because it always ends up as a gender topic, we somehow miss the broader picture and the bigger picture, and it doesn't yield the kind of results that we all hope to achieve with diversity and inclusion as we go along. So your take on it.
Yes, thank you very much, Syed. And I think it's a very valid point that has come up in terms of talking about the class. And I think that, of course, in the first world or in the developed world, you start hearing also about sexual orientation, and it broadens up. So diversity and inclusion is much broader than that. These topics are actually becoming very relevant to this part of the world as well. So we can't avoid it. But I don't want to bring that in, because I think that on its own is a different and a very broad discussion that's worth looking into. But what we're talking about when it comes in terms of income, when it comes in terms of social class, I think that in countries, especially in developing countries, where you find some of the medium of language, or the medium or the language for business is English or French, you find that most of the people get left behind. So that in itself, and I'll give you a very small example, is where people get left behind. So when you talk about diversity and inclusion, how much are we going to start including local languages? How much are we going to integrate that and make it acceptable that if somebody doesn't speak properly, a certain international language can still take part and be included in decision makings? Because I think inclusion is not only about being employed, but actually being part of the decision making within, whether it is your organization or whether it is the larger ecosystem. And what I'm seeing right now is that this will be actually an advantage when it comes to the aftermath of COVID-19, is that because it's going to become localized, not speaking an international language may not necessarily be such a huge disadvantage. I would like to quickly point out something that Birgit also talked about in terms of the healthcare sector. I think that I completely agree with her. That's one sector that never got enough attention, and it's getting quite the attention that is really worth it. And I think that especially for this part of the world in Africa, we are seeing more and more the fact that the leaders were able to be airlifted to France, to New York, to London, if things went south. And now everybody's stuck in their own country. There is no airlifting. And I think that is the wake-up call. And that is the most positive side. When you asked that question, I think it escaped me, that was the most positive side, that the specialized local skills are going to become very valuable. And that is what we want to see. Now, how does the entire ecosystem now gear toward that? That's going to be a long term. So short term, we might suffer, but I think on the long term, there'll be some advantage. And I just want to put on a light touch. Like, thank you for talking about the boomers and Gen Z and the millennials, but what about the Gen Xers? We are the forgotten generation, aren't we? The only reason I'm saying that is because Gen Xers actually are more entrepreneurial. We are much more into enterprise, into private sector, and we're seeing some of them really stepping up at this point in time, stepping in where some of the governments have failed. We've seen Jack Ma, we've seen Elon Musk, and we've seen a lot of others who are stepping up at this time. So I think that this generational thing is great, and I think each generation has got its strength and weakness. And what it's doing during this crisis and pandemic is we're seeing it come together. Everybody's chipping in a little bit, and I'm seeing quite a lot of optimism in that.
Yes, to your comment on our generation. Thank you for that. Just quickly, because we have now 3 or 4 minutes, so I'll quickly go to Marine and James. James because he's on ground zero, and Marine because she's doing well, or her industry is doing well. Is diversity and inclusion a more tick in the box thing for many organizations who claim to be diverse and inclusive, rather than living the actual spirit of diversity and inclusion? And do you see any change in it? So while organization may be diverse and getting a pool of talent into the organization, but they may not be inclusive because they don't actually believe in that, and they still want to be very homogeneous in the way they run their organization. James, your take on this?
Oh, I think there's hypocrisy all over the place, and there's people who talk a good game. 15 years ago, my daughter, when we lived in Switzerland, my daughter started dating the other, she was a top basketball player. She started dating the star of the boys team. He was Nigerian, and he was a great kid. And, I loved the kid, and I didn't care. I mean, I tried to raise my kids not to see color and differences. And, the next weekend or the next week, I was with a senior manager in my company. He comes to me and says, "Hey, what do you think about Morgan's boyfriend?" I said, "What do you mean?" Nice kid. He goes, "You know what I mean." I said, "What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, come on, you know what I mean." And this is a guy I had seen give speeches and talk about diversity, and we've got to, be racially diverse, and we've got to hire women. And what he was basically telling me is, I'm fine to work with somebody, let's say someone from Africa or African American, but I don't want him in my house. I don't want him in my neighborhood. And the hypocrisy was just dripping off this guy's tongue. And I realized that, there's a ton of people that play the game, and they'll speak a good game. But the real definition of diversity, valuing diversity, is, do you welcome it into your home? Do you mind if your daughter marries someone of a different ethnicity? Do you mind? Because if you mind, then you really don't value it, because you've got to welcome it into your house. It's not a 9 to 5 thing. And so I think there's hypocrisy all over the place. And there are plenty of people who are, politically correct and they understand they've got to talk a good game, but just look at their life. Look where they live. Look who they hang out with. Look, what do they tell their kids? Do they tell their kids you only date within your ethnic group? I mean, if you're telling your kids that, you can't go and say you value diversity. I mean, I've got 5 kids. I told all 5 of them, marry who you love and marry who makes you happy. And I don't care. You know, for my 5 kids, I've got 2 mixed marriage kids. I don't care. I'm looking at the person, not their passport, not their skin color, not what language was their mother tongue. This is all nuance. It's what's the individual, what's their character. And so I think we're full of it. And I think what we have to do is drive those people out. When I have them in my organizations, I see the hypocrites and I show them the door and get them out.
Thank you, James. Good to see that I'm in good company. I have 5 kids too. Marine, your take on the topic, is diversity and inclusion more of a tick in the box approach, even for those who practice it or who claim to be practicing it, while they are diverse in terms of hiring and bringing people in, but they are definitely not inclusive? Your take.
I think, the point that I would say on this, I mean, I live in Singapore, which is often cited as an example for diversity. I mean, we have a lot of different communities and they make a point to make sure that there's not one area only with Chinese and another area only with Malay and so on and so forth, right? So I live in an area that's, designed to be literally inclusive. I mean, Singapore was created for that reason and on these principles. I do believe that there is a little bit of everything, obviously, but also that we are able now to kind of hold companies accountable. We also have laws on our side, which we didn't have before. And I come from France, so you imagine, the laws on discriminations are pretty heavy. They're not enough, obviously. It's all about the people, but at least, there's something that we didn't have 50 years ago and we do now. I think we need data to be able to hold companies accountable and say, well, you want to talk the talk, then walk the talk, then show us your numbers. How many people do you have? How many women do you have on your board? And let's just openly talk about it. And we should have a section on Glassdoor and say, this is how diverse that company is. I also think, because it's been a big discussion in my industry, and especially actually in hospitality, and the world of hotels, for them, it's not a nice to have, it is a necessity, because they are growing so fast. They are not able to sustain their growth if they don't open to women, LGBTQ, disabled, and so on and so forth. And we were actually talking with a diversity and inclusion director from one of the big hotel groups, and they were explaining to us how many measures they put in place in India to be able to give the means to women to work in the hotels, and that included bringing them home and organizing shuttle services because they just did not feel safe going home after darkness. And it's just understanding the market and saying, well, we're not going to grow without everybody. We need you guys to keep growing and to keep going. So it's not a question. It is 100% a necessity for everybody.
Thank you. Last question to Birgit, to you, and it has come via Zoom. And in the wake of this pandemic, where there will be a lot of job losses, a lot of crisis happening on economy front, also on the human front, would creating more jobs for your own communities, your own people, overtake diversity? And isn't that a better approach? Your take?
Well, for me, what really is the important part is not what we call maybe inclusivity or diversity. It's rather opportunity, that everybody who wants to make a living and has a project of his life can actually have a go and try it. I mean, we are diverse. None of us is different. Everybody has different talents. Everybody has different interests. And there's also no guarantee in life of success. But at least you should have an opportunity to try and realize the project that you have. And in that respect, I feel, of course, after Corona, there will be opportunities to move on. There's the necessity to move on. a lot of businesses and personal life perspectives will have been shattered. But I think that's also the beauty of life, that people move on. And I think especially in the global south, societies like Pakistan, also Africa, and also the Europeans after World War II, they've shown that people want to move on and they want to have a better life and they want to come out of the mess they have. And people are incredibly creative when they are faced with challenges. So I really do believe in the positive energy of people who are faced with a crisis. And I feel especially women, and not only women, but women are incredibly good at moving their families and their communities forward. And they're incredibly creative even to make the sacrifice for the next generation. So yes, I feel that the people who suffer most from Corona, especially also these disadvantaged layers of society, I don't only want to talk about women, because there are ethnic, there are religious minorities, there are regional people who might not have access to energy, to clean water, to fertile land. And that these people are incredibly creative, because creativity comes from the lack and restriction of resources. It doesn't come from having all, let's say, the money in the world and you just buy something and you hire someone to solve your problems. It really comes from the challenge to make do with restricted resources. And I'm pretty sure...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're being asked to close the session.
Okay, sorry, but I really do believe that these people, and I would like to celebrate the creativity of these people who have limited resources. We'll see an amazing explosion of this creativity, I'm pretty sure.
Thank you very much. You're a lot more inclusive in your thought. That clearly I can make a comment. So with this, we come to the close. I would just like to close basically on two beautiful quotes I've heard and have followed in my career. So first of them is that, think about it, if everyone is thinking alike, that means nobody's thinking. Right? And it's very profound, right? The second quote, if two people are thinking alike, one of them is redundant. And I would more or less close the topic or this discussion on this note. I thank all the panelists for very insightful comments. Some of you were skeptical of the future, but most of you were very optimistic in the wake of this pandemic and how the new normal will evolve as we move along. I wish you all good luck. I thank you on behalf of Corporate Pakistan Group and Nutshell Forum for being part of this. I hope people listening out there benefited from the great insight. Once again, thank you so very much. Signing off.
Thank you so much.